Hello, and welcome to week 3 of Medical Ethics. Today's lecture is on Judith Jarvis Thompson's paper, A Defense of Abortion. This paper is a bit of a classic in the medical ethics canon. It's a lot of fun to read because there are many great thought experiments in it. As we go through it, we will discuss a little bit about the methodology of employing thought experiments in philosophy, and of course look at the thought experiments that she provides. One of the things that might be frustrating as we deal with this paper is that Thompson doesn't provide a lot of easy answers about the kinds of abortion cases that are the hardest to deal with. She says a lot of great things about why it's permissible to perform an abortion when the fetus is the result of a rape. She says a lot of great things about why it is permissible to perform an abortion when the mother would otherwise die. What she doesn't say a lot about are cases where a mother wants an abortion for some other reason, because it would be inconvenient to carry the child to term, because she doesn't believe that she can take care of it, and so on. These are the cases that are really the difficult ones, and these cases are cases about which Thompson doesn't offer any easy answers. What she does do, though, is give us a great framework for thinking through these further cases on our own. And I think that is really why this paper is so important. So the first thing that Thompson does in her paper is concede that the fetus is a person. She notes that many arguments about abortion are arguments about this claim, about whether or not the fetus, the embryo, has the status of a person. And I mentioned in the last couple of lectures, the point here is that personhood is supposed to confer a certain kind of moral status on an organism. In particular, personhood is supposed to indicate that the organism that is being treated as a person has certain rights, and in particular, the right to not be killed, the right to life, as we call it. So Thompson wants to concede that the fetus is a person. She makes clear in her paper, though, that she's not conceding it because she thinks there's an obvious answer to the question. She notes that many arguments that try to claim as their conclusion that the fetus is a person have the structure of a slippery slope. Such arguments attempt to claim that it's very difficult to draw a line in one particular spot between cases in which we are interested. In this instance, these would be cases where we have persons, and cases that are irrelevant. These would be, in the case of abortion, cases where we don't have persons in front of us. Now, most people arguing about abortion are going to admit that perhaps we don't have a person from the moment of conception. Not everyone. There are certainly people who argue that there is a person from the moment of conception because a person has a soul on their view, and that soul is somehow conferred at the moment of conception, and that's really what moral status is about, and that's really what personhood is about for them. Such individuals will want to claim that we have a person from the moment of conception. Many or most people that take the so-called pro-life position think that there ought to be substantive restrictions on abortion, don't believe that there's a person from the moment of conception. Rather, they believe that at some point in the process of development, we have a person. The slippery slope style argument is supposed to claim that really there's no easy way to draw the line, and therefore we really shouldn't draw it. Thus, many cases of abortion that we might be okay with are going to turn out to be inadmissible because they are going to be cases that we can't easily tell apart from the cases that we want to claim involve persons. Thompson doesn't address these arguments so directly. She sidesteps the whole issue by saying that she's going to concede that the fetus, even from the moment of conception perhaps, is a person. The reason she's going to concede this is not because she believes it, and in fact at the end of the paper she takes away this concession and speaks as though it weren't being assumed. She wants to concede it, though, because she thinks that too much attention has been focused on this question, and not enough attention has been focused on the moves that get us from the claim that the fetus is a person to the claim that it is impermissible to kill it. She thinks that those moves, from personhood to it's not right to kill it or not okay to kill it, you're violating its right if you kill it, need to be questioned. And she thinks if we question them, we can see that there are places where the steps involved are either false, they rest on false conclusions, or deeply questionable. So Thompson's going to argue that even if the fetus is a person, the move from the claim that it's a person to the claim that abortion is impermissible is not obvious. She's going to focus us on this particular move. She gives a kind of simple argument that she thinks is found in many people who write from a so-called pro-life position. That argument has the following steps. Every person has a right to life. The fetus is a person. I have bolded this because this is the thing that she is conceding. Therefore, the fetus has a right to life. Thus, the fetus may not be killed, and an abortion may not be performed. This is the simple argument. The step in which Thompson is most interested in this paper, the one that she will question, is really the one about the right to life. Thompson is going to point out, first of all, that there's a certain ambiguity in claiming that the fetus has a right to life. We might mean by this that the fetus has a certain non-interference right, which means that we cannot kill it. Alternatively, we might mean by this that the fetus has a certain right to minimal benefits that it needs to stay alive. And Thompson is going to want to push us towards the view that abortion, although it is something that kills the fetus, is better understood as a withdrawal of benefits. She's also going to try to separate the claim about the right to life from the claim that killing is impermissible in all cases. What she's going to do is discuss cases where an entity has a right to life, but doesn't have the right to use a mother's body for its survival, and therefore, by withdrawing the support of the mother's body, we are killing it, but that killing is not going to be unjust. Okay, so she's going to have a strange, I think, middle position, where she wants to say, yes, the fetus has a right to life, or at least concede that it does, but then point out that that doesn't mean that it's always wrong to kill it, because it might be that although the fetus has a right to life, it doesn't have a right to use the mother's body, and therefore, even though we are killing it, we are not killing it unjustly. She's going to want to amend the claim about the right to life to be a claim not about killing simplicator, but a claim about killing unjustly. So what she's going to say is that the right to life is not just a right not to be killed, but a right to be not killed unjustly. We will get there, though. So that's the simple argument. Going over once again the main strategy that Thompson will employ in this paper, she's going to look more closely at the right to life and ask what it amounts to in various cases, using different thought experiments, different intuitions. And she's going to try to drive a wedge between the right not to be killed and the right to have aid provided when that aid is necessary for survival. Reiterating again, the difference here is that the right not to be killed is what we can call a non-interference right. It is a right that entitles the bearer not to be interfered with in certain ways. The right to aid necessary for survival is a right to a certain positive benefit. This means that it's a right to have something provided. Now, generally speaking, people are more ready to accept claims of non-interference rights than rights to benefit. To see this, consider the fact that most of us would agree that it is flat out wrong, we have violated someone's right, if we go up to them and harm them or kill them on the street, or if we go up to them and steal from them. Fewer of us would agree that we violated someone's right if we fail to provide an individual on the street with shelter and that individual freezes to death. We might think that if we fail to provide that shelter, that food, we have done something wrong. We might think if we fail to provide that shelter, that food, we can be called callous or greedy, uncaring, that we are bad people. But I think at least some of us would balk at the suggestion that by failing to provide housing, we have violated a right that individuals have an entitlement to. Now, intuitions about this are, I think, less clear than they would have been maybe 30 years ago. And I think more of us are now inclined to view things like housing as a kind of right. I still think, though, if you ask many people, you're going to find some difference like this. We take it to be a right, uncontroversially, not to be interfered with. We are less certain about supposed rights to have things given to us, even if the outcome in each case is the same. The person's going to freeze to death if we don't help them. They're also going to die if we interfere with them, but we think that interfering with them violates their rights, even though many of us perhaps wouldn't think that failing to provide benefit violates any rights. This is going to be a big theme of this paper, that there is a difference between saying someone has a right to something and saying that it would be right for us to do that thing. Thompson's going to want to make room for saying there is no right to certain benefits, even though a good person might provide them. And if you don't provide them in certain cases, that would make you a bad person. There's a difference, though, between claiming that failing to provide something makes an individual a bad person and the claim that by failing to provide that thing, an individual has thereby violated some right. Now, abortion is a tricky case because abortion can be understood both as a case in which a fetus is killed by external interference and as a case in which aid necessary for survival is withdrawn. Right? When abortions are standardly performed, the fetuses are killed during the procedure. Those fetuses are, in some sense, being interfered with. If that interference weren't to take place, the fetus would normally develop and be viable. But that interference is also a withdrawal of benefits that the fetus is getting from the mother's body. And so this is going to be a tricky case because it's a case where it looks like one action might be viewed both as a violation of a non-interference right and as a simple withdrawal of benefits that we might think the fetus is entitled to by right, or we might deny that the fetus is entitled to by right. To focus our attention on this difference, Thompson gives a very famous example involving an adult violinist. She says, you wake up in the morning and find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist, a famous unconscious violinist. He has been found to have a fatal kidney ailment, and the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records and found that you alone have the right blood type to help. They have therefore kidnapped you, and last night the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours, so that your kidneys can be used to extract poison from his blood as well as your own. The director of the hospital now tells you, look, we're very sorry that the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we had known, but still, they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. To unplug you would be to kill him. But never mind, it is only for 9 months. By then, he will have recovered from his ailment and can be safely unplugged from you. So this is the example we are focusing on, this case of a violinist that is attached to you in the middle of the night without your consent. You are told in the morning that you cannot possibly detach this violinist because that would be to kill the violinist, and therefore you have an obligation to allow this violinist to use your organs for 9 months. Thompson expects us to have a particular reaction to this example. The claim that one can't be unplugged from the violinist in this case, she says, is outrageous, and she expects us, the listeners, to agree. She points out that it might be nice to accept this burden. It might be something that a really saintly moral agent might do. We aren't violating a right if we don't accept this burden. We are then supposed to, having had this reaction to this violinist case, reflect on certain instances of abortion that have similar features. In particular, cases of abortion where pregnancy is the result of rape. These cases obviously have more than a little in common with the thought experiment. In both cases, we have an individual with a supposed right to life who requires the use of someone else's body to stay alive. In both cases, pregnancy as a result of rape and the violinist experiment, the use of another's body is burdensome and requires significant sacrifice. Moreover, in both cases, the presence of the organism that requires the use of our organs is not there because we have done anything that could be viewed as consent. We haven't performed any actions to get this violinist attached to us. We have rather been kidnapped in the violinist case or raped in the case of pregnancy as a result of rape. Unplugging the individual with the right to life, in this case, means that it will surely die. That is also true in the case of the pregnancy as a result of rape. So we are supposed to look at this case, see the similarities to the case of pregnancy as a result of rape, and conclude that pregnancy as a result of rape is permissible because surely it's permissible to unplug the violinist in such a case. Now, Thompson concedes that in many cases, those who oppose abortion in general can and do recognize exceptions in cases where pregnancy is due to rape. I think that you will find many people who think that abortion in general is wrong, someone like Marquis, for example, who will concede that abortion in cases of rape might be or is permissible. Thompson does, though, question how these kinds of exceptions are supposed to work. She says the following: they can say that persons have a right to life only if they didn't come into existence because of rape, or they can say that all persons have a right to life, but some have less of a right to life than others. So she gives a couple of formulations of what she thinks the individual who can say, well, pregnancy as a result of rape allows for abortion and ordinary pregnancy doesn't. She gives a couple of things that she thinks such an individual might try to say, and she points out that these things sound terrible in certain ways. So she tries to suggest, after having gotten the concession that perhaps abortion in the case of rape is totally permissible, that in fact stopping there is more difficult than it may seem. She suggests that whether a fetus has a right to life shouldn't depend on how it was brought into being. If fetuses have a right to life, this is something they have in virtue of what they are, not in virtue of some accidental fact about how they've been produced. This is the suggestion here. So she's going to get the concession that in the case of pregnancy as a result of rape, the fetus can be aborted. She's going to suggest that a way to take that, or the way to take that, is as a denial of a right to life in the case of some fetuses. And then she's going to argue that the denial of the right to life in that case has to do with some feature that appears to be somewhat accidental and arbitrary. I think she's right. Our intuitions about who has a right to life seem to rest more about what's going on in the individual than they do about questions concerning the creation of that individual. I think here Thompson might move a bit too quickly when she provides this analysis of the move from abortion in the case of rape to the more general case. It does sound odd to say that fetuses that have been produced by rape have less of a right to life than others, or that they have no right to life, whereas other fetuses do have rights to life. But I question whether this is the right thing to say in these cases. So one reason to think that it would be somewhat odd to deny that a fetus that is a result of rape has a right to life is that ordinarily we don't think that individuals lose their rights unless they have done something wrong. So people have a right to free movement. You can lose that if you commit a serious crime. Now you can be in prison. Your right to free movement has been suspended. If a fetus is a result of rape, that fetus hasn't done anything to make us suspend its right, and so it seems counterintuitive to say it has no right to life or less of a right to life simply because of something that someone else did. What I think Thompson is skipping over here is a possibility that we might concede that the fetus does have a right to life, but also that in the case of rape, this right can be overridden or outweighed by the rights of the mother. And I also think that this idea of rights that in extreme cases can be overridden is not something ad hoc that we would only bring in this particular instance, but rather something that shows up in a lot of difficult cases. So imagine a sinking ship. It might be true on a sinking ship that every individual has the right to use a life raft. It might even be true that in virtue of being persons, every individual on that ship has equal right to use a life raft. But if it turns out that there are too many people, there are more people than life rafts, we are going to need to use some other criterion to determine who gets a life raft and who doesn't. For example, some of the individuals might have paid an extra fee that we think entitles them to life rafts. Or we might think women and children can have the life rafts first. And so on. So these are cases where it looks like we can concede both that everyone has a right to the life rafts, and maybe in virtue of all being persons, everyone has equal rights to the life rafts, but that in the presence of true scarcity, it will also be true that some people actually have more of a right to the life raft, and that their getting the life raft can override someone else's. There are lots of different analyses of situations like this, and I don't want to suggest that the one I have given is the correct one. I simply mean to suggest that there are options for someone who wants to deny that the right to abortion in the case of rape generalizes to all cases, and wants, therefore, to push back against Thompson's suggestion that they will have to grant some funny thing where only some fetuses end up having the right to life. I'm suggesting that it might be consistent to say, no, all fetuses have the right to life, and in fact, equal rights to life. However, there are other factors that dictate that in some cases, these rights to life can be overridden. That would be analogous to someone having paid for a life raft. Thompson points out in her paper that claims that certain individuals might have or fail to have a right to life because of how they were produced have a rather unpleasant sound. I think this is a bit of a non sequitur on her part. I think that when you do medical ethics, many arguments that we make or read are going to have an unpleasant sound. These aren't easy things to talk about, and situations that are really hard require hard choices that aren't easy to make. And so the claim about these sorts of claims having an unpleasantness about them is neither here nor there, as far as I'm concerned. So to recap, so far, Thompson has committed to the claim that abortion in cases of rape is permissible. And I think her argument using the violinist case for this claim is pretty strong. I have strong intuitions about the violinist case. The case of pregnancy as a result of rape seems to be fairly analogous. And so, my strong intuitions about the violinist case should carry over. We might, of course, question the appropriateness of the violinist case. And to do this, we need to think, well, what's different? One thing that's different, obviously, is that in the violinist case, we have an individual that is clearly alive and clearly a person that is being attached, whereas in the case of pregnancy as a result of rape, we have a fetus. And we might think, therefore, that the thought experiment comparison is not fair. However, we need to recall that Thompson is conceding that the fetus is a person. Therefore, the differences between the thought experiment and the case we are trying to illuminate are a feature of her example rather than what we would call a bug. Right? In her violinist case, I think the intuition that we are allowed to detach the violinist is quite strong, and there it's clear that the violinist is a person. And so, we get a really strong result about permissibility, even when the personhood question is completely settled. If we don't think the fetus is a person, we can reject the thought experiment. The point is that Thompson is trying to concede that, and so this feature of her thought experiment, the unequivocal personhood of the violinist, is really something that follows from what she's trying to concede. Of course, there is a lot more burden involved in having a full-grown individual attached to you. It's strange and grotesque. These features of the thought experiment might be misleading us. These are things to think about. After having reached her first conclusion, that abortion in the case of non-consensual intercourse is permissible, Thompson moves on to a view that she refers to as the extreme view. This extreme view holds that abortion is impermissible even when it is necessary to save a mother's life. She points out that this type of argument typically relies on an alleged distinction between killing and letting die. Now, we will see this distinction in other papers and have occasion to talk about it at greater length. The basic idea here is that if an abortion is necessary to save a mother's life, it might be that that abortion is still impermissible because by aborting a fetus, we are killing, whereas if we just let the fetus grow, that will have the inevitable result that the mother dies, but no one has killed anyone. And so often it's claimed in ethics, and especially in these medical ethics sorts of classes, that there's a significant moral difference between instances where we actively kill and instances where we simply fail to intervene. Resting on this difference, the extreme view constructs the following argument. Aborting a fetus is directly killing an innocent person, while failing to abort is only a case of letting someone die. That's premise one. Premise two, directly killing an innocent person is always and absolutely impermissible. This is one of 4 different formulations of this premise that she provides. It's the one she takes up. That's why I've plugged it in here. Conclusion, an abortion may not be performed. So really, it's the fact that abortion is killing and killing is impermissible that means abortion is impermissible. The idea that the mother would die, while certainly lamentable, doesn't have any effect, according to this argument, on what we should do. Because we have an obligation not to kill. We also, in many cases, have an obligation to save lives. But the idea is that the obligation not to kill is stronger than the obligation to save lives. And that therefore, when we can either do one of the two, we have to go with the obligation not to kill. You can see again a difference between what looks like a non-interference right, not killing means not violating interference rights, and a right to positive benefit, providing some procedure that the mother needs to stay alive. The suggestion of this argument is that the non-interference right is more important. It's worse to violate it. Therefore, what we're supposed to do in this case, while lamentable, is clear. Thompson takes on premise 2 directly. She suggests, using her violinist example, that premise 2 is simply false. Surely, she notes, you are allowed to detach the violinist from your body, even if doing so will kill the violinist. So, the violinist has been attached to you. In this case, we're to imagine that unless you detach the violinist, you will die. Thompson suggests that it must turn out to be the case, that you have the right to unplug this violinist from you so that you can save your own life. As a matter of self-defense, you must be able to do that, she says. That, however, looks like something that premise 2 is not going to allow. This is, after all, an innocent person. By unplugging the violinist, we are, after all, directly killing it. Premise 2 tells us that that is always and absolutely impermissible. Thompson is saying, no, it's not. Surely, if you have the violinist plugged into you, it is permissible for you to unplug it if you will otherwise die. Therefore, premise 2 is false. When Thompson first tries to take on premise 2, She looks at it from the perspective of a participant, in particular, the perspective of the individual to whom the violinist has been attached. She points out that, in fact, many discussions of abortion don't distinguish between what a mother can do when she has a fetus inside of her versus what a third party, like a doctor, can do. And this makes good sense because, as she points out, it isn't safe or easy to abort your own fetus. Normally, when we speak of abortion, we're talking about someone going to a medical professional and getting a procedure done. But Thompson thinks that this conflation of what a third party can do and what a mother can do is too quick. She says we can't simply read off what a person may do from what a third party may do. I think Thompson is right about this because there are cases, and again, we can think of cases outside of this one, where participants have rights that third-party bystanders don't. For example, imagine a case where there's a scarce resource and no real way that would be just to figure out which of two parties gets it. So there's, say, a medication that you and I both need. If we split it and each get half, we're both going to die because that's not enough. Each of us needs the full dose. There's no way to figure out which of the two of us is entitled to the dose. We both have equal rights to it. In such a case, it seems that either party can struggle to get the medication. I mean, if there's really no right and we can't really decide on something like flipping a coin, it seems like maybe we can just say, well, whoever gets it, gets it. What we can't do, though, even if we concede that both of us can try to get the medication and maybe prevent the other from getting it, it wouldn't be fair in such a case for some third party that's not a participant to step in and decide the matter. That seems to me to be obviously wrong. We've stipulated at the outset that there are no grounds on which the matter can be fairly decided. And so, in lieu of such grounds, we are saying whoever gets it, gets it. It seems fair for you and I to do different things to each other to try to prevent one another from getting the medication so that we can have it ourselves. It doesn't seem fair to me for a third party to intervene so as to decide the outcome in one way or another. That would seem to be unfair, a kind of interference that wouldn't be allowed. This is just to say that this looks like a case where the participants are permitted to do certain things that the third party is not permitted to do. And that seems to be what Thompson is talking about here. Right? The mother might be able to save her own life as self-defense, even though we don't concede that some third party can perform a procedure that would save the mother's life. Thompson tries to develop this suggestion further, and in fact wants to say that it's not just the mother who can decide to terminate the child, the fetus. It's also a third party. She starts out with another thought experiment, the expanding baby case. She says the following: suppose you find yourself trapped in a tiny house with a growing child. I mean, a very tiny house and a rapidly growing child. You are already up against the wall of the house, and in a few minutes you'll be crushed to death if nothing is done to stop him from growing. He'll be hurt, but in the end he'll simply burst open the house, and walk out a free man. Now I could well understand if a bystander were to say, there's nothing we can do for you. We cannot choose between your life and his. We cannot be the ones to decide who is to live. We cannot intervene. So in the first iteration of this expanding baby case, Thompson is saying, if you are trapped in that house with this expanding baby, you are within your rights to survive, to fight for your life, to kill the baby. In the first iteration, she thinks it's okay, or at least understandable, if some bystander walking by were to say, look, I don't feel that it's right for me to get involved. because I can't choose between your life and the expanding baby's life. So before we get into this question of third parties versus participants, it's worthwhile to pause here and think about the use of thought experiments in general. Thompson uses a number of great thought experiments in this paper, and so it's worth asking why anyone would use thought experiments to begin with. What are the benefits? What are the drawbacks? Well, I think one of the main reasons Thompson relies on these thought experiments is to help us remove certain emotional factors that might distort our ethical intuitions. So if we can move the debate to some example that doesn't evoke the same kind of emotional response in us as the initial example, we might view that as removing a kind of distorting influence and allowing us to get clarity. If we were to imagine, for example, a helpless fetus instead of an expanding baby, we might have a hard time saying that it can be killed in self-defense. Because naturally speaking, we all have strong impulses to save, I think, things that look like ordinary humans, and especially when they appear small and defenseless. So one thing that might be accomplished by talking about the expanding baby is, to me, a bit monstrous. And so my ordinary, perhaps, repulsion at the idea of killing something that looks like a tiny baby is going to be removed. So that's a benefit of using a thought experiment, and I think it's a benefit that Thompson is getting out of using thought experiments here. It's worth noting, though, that thought experiments can also introduce factors into cases that can cause distortions. The expanding baby case is also, in addition to being incapable of maybe triggering the same emotional responses as a case where a fetus is killed in self-defense, it's also, in its own right, grotesque. This is something from a horror movie, this expanding baby. And so, maybe by testing our intuitions in such a case, and then trying to import them back onto the case of the fetus, we are not getting clarity, we are distorting. I don't want to claim that either of these is going on. I simply want to point out that either of these can be going on. The same holds for the violinist case. There's something quite disgusting in the idea that a violinist is now attached to me. I find it to be grotesque. And that disgust reaction might have an influence on the intuitions that we have. The lesson here is that ultimately we need to examine thought experiments carefully to make sure we aren't introducing or removing things that are crucial. And, this is just an unfortunate feature of ethical philosophy. We are relying a lot on our intuitions. Our intuitions seem like they have an emotional component that might be impossible to remove. Perhaps if we removed the emotional component, we would get terrible results. The mere fact that we have emotional components to our responses doesn't mean that those responses are incorrect. There's arguments about this because it's been pointed out that when individuals approach circumstances with less emotion, they tend to think like consequentialists, people who think that the right action is only a matter of which action leads to the best outcome, which means that they're more willing to violate what look like rights. Consequentialists love this result and say, aha, well, that's because the emotions were distortions. Non-consequentialists say, no, the emotions were actually key to telling us what was right and what was wrong. And so the cool-headed person who reasons without the emotion isn't therefore getting it right. I point this out just to mention that whether or not emotions of a certain kind are important to ethical debate is an open question. So to get back to the main question that Thompson wants to ask with this case, she first brings it up so that we will concede that the person trapped in the house has every right to kill the expanding baby in self-defense. In fact, though, Thompson goes on to say that third parties can get involved in cases of abortion, and that there isn't the strong asymmetry of what can be done that she initially suggests. So one of the things about this paper is that it is quite exploratory, and she tries different things, and in some cases she seems to take back what she initially said, or at least revise it, which isn't a feature that makes her paper bad. It's actually a paper that is strong, I think, for this reason. You get the sense of someone thinking aloud. So, although she initially suggests that in many cases there will be a kind of asymmetry between what a participant can do and what a third party can do, she goes on to say that the case of abortion is not one of these cases. What she goes on to say is that, in fact, there's an important disanalogy between abortion and the thought experiment involving the house and the expanding baby, and therefore that the house and expanding baby case is somewhat misleading. The disanalogy is that the house case is supposed to involve a person and an expanding baby that have equal rights to using the house. And therefore, we can't say, if we are third parties, that one of the two gets it and the other has to be booted on pain of death. But in abortion, she points out, the mother is actually more accurately depicted as the owner of the house. It's her body that is going to be destroyed, that's going to die. And so there's a disanalogy here that allows third parties, or in fact even requires third parties, if they have to make the decision in favor of the mother. So, as the owner of the house, the mother has certain claim rights on third parties to intervene so that her rights as an owner are respected. This is using the language from the first lecture again. When you have a right, that right entails claims on other individuals. One of the things that is true of property rights is that others can't use your property, but also that there are at least certain individuals in society who do have to intervene to help you protect your property and get your rights. These would be people like police officers, etc. Impartiality in such cases doesn't require third parties not to get involved. Instead, impartiality requires third parties in such a case to side with the mother, because she has a claim right that the expanding baby, or the infant in the case of abortion, the fetus rather, doesn't. Thompson brings in a further case, which is supposed to make this kind of structure clear. She says if Jones has found and fastened on a certain coat, which he needs to keep him from freezing, but which Smith also needs to keep him from freezing, then it is not impartiality that says, I cannot choose between you when Smith owns the coat. So the idea here, again, is that even though both Smith and Jones need the coat to keep from freezing to death, one of the two has a claim right to the coat, and that therefore, if we are third parties, impartiality doesn't dictate that we simply not get involved. In fact, the sum total of claim rights that we have indicate that Smith should have the coat. So this is a case in which the property right to a coat entitles the owner to certain claims on third parties. Now, in individual cases, it isn't true that absolutely anybody must step in to help the initial owner secure the coat. If it's risky, if Smith and Jones are willing to kill anyone who tries to get the coat, we arguably aren't obligated to step in and try to wrestle the coat away from Jones. In those cases, though, there are going to be individuals in a society that have special obligations in virtue of their function, their position, police officers, and so on, that will be obligated to step in. If there is no risk, though, or perhaps if one is already involved in some way or another, it does seem like the thing to do is give the coat to Smith. Let's say you stumble on the coat before either Smith or Jones recognizes it's there. Both of them now come at you and demand it. If you know that it is Smith's property, you should give it back to Smith. That's a suggestion. So what if you find the coat, must give it to only one of the two? I say as a question, but I think the answer is fairly clear. Surely you should give it to the original owner. So here we have a case where it's life and death. The person who doesn't get the coat will die. Where the participants have certain rights, and also third parties are permitted, and in some cases, if they have special functions, obligated to see to it that one of the two parties gets the jacket. The main thing that Thompson wants to address in her paper, though, is this idea of a right to life. And in particular, the idea that there might be a certain troublesome ambiguity in the claim that a fetus has a right to life. Because, as Thompson observes, there's a troublesome ambiguity in the claim that any individual has a right to life. The troublesome ambiguity has to do with the idea that there are at least two different ways of interpreting a supposed life to right. One of these is a non-interference sense. On such a sense, someone has a right to life if they have a right not to have their life taken or jeopardized by others for no good reason. If you have that kind of non-interference right, you don't have the right to benefits needed for life. That's one sense in which we might understand a right to life. We could call this a non-interference sense. We could also note that it's a minimal sense. There's also what she refers to as a right to the bare minimum. In this sense, the right to life tells us something a bit more than the non-interference right alone. If you have a right to this bare minimum, you have the right to just those benefits needed to keep you alive. You don't have the right to more than this, but nevertheless, if you have this second right, you have more than an individual who just has the non-interference right to life. Right? Now, the right to life entails a certain obligation to provide you with things. Thompson brings in a further example, further thought experiment, that is meant to illustrate the difference between these two rights. She discusses the actor Henry Fonda. She notes that it might be the case that she is sick unto death, she's going to die, and can only be saved by a touch of Henry Fonda. She points out that she doesn't have such a right. If Henry Fonda is far away, and Henry Fonda knows about this and says no thanks, her rights have not been violated. This would be a case where she's clearly going to have a non-interference right to life. No one can come up and kill her, even though she's on her deathbed. But she doesn't have a right to minimal benefit. She cannot claim that her rights are being violated if she doesn't get what she needs to continue living. She points out that in these kinds of cases, it would be nice, it might be the right thing to do, even, for Henry Fonda to fly in and give her what she needs to stay alive. But this is not a case where failure to give that is a violation of a right. She points to the violinist case again. She points out that it might be that it would be kind, it would be wonderful, you would be a moral saint if you allowed the violinist to use your kidneys. And so your action would definitely have moral resonance, but the violinist doesn't have the right to use your kidneys. So this Henry Fonda case illustrates really beautifully that there can sometimes be a difference between what it is that it would be morally good to do and what it is that we have a right to demand that others do. What this difference amounts to in practice is a difficult question that I will leave for further consideration. We need now to turn, though, away from the Henry Fonda case, where we have a case where someone doesn't provide a benefit and an individual dies of their own accord, back to the case like abortion, where failing to provide benefits is in fact killing. So what about when the withdrawal of benefits is killing? So let's go back to the violinist. The violinist, we can now say, has a non-interference right that we not kill him unjustly. We can deny, though, using this language, that the violinist has a right to use my body to stay alive. If we unplug the violinist, we are withdrawing benefits needed for the violinist's survival. This does seem permissible, as the violinist doesn't have the right to use my body. But, and this is the tough question, aren't we also interfering with him, with the violinist, in a way that leads to his death? And isn't this, therefore, killing? Now, Thompson first points out that whatever we say about this case, the right not to be killed, possessed by the violinist, does offer the violinist many protections. The right not to be killed means that we can't do many things to the violinist. We can't slit the violinist's throat. We can't shoot him. If we try to detach the violinist and succeed and the violinist is still alive, we can't shoot the violinist at that point. So whatever we end up saying about the case of withdrawing aid, even if that in and of itself is more or less an act that we could describe as killing, that doesn't mean that the right to non-interference that the violinist has is completely moot, right? There's still going to be a lot of protections that the violinist is afforded by this right to non-interference life. Thompson then suggests that perhaps a participant can unplug the violinist from her body, but that third parties are not able to do this. So now we're getting this move again, where there might be a difference between what I can do if the violinist is attached to me and what a third party is able to do. So maybe it's okay for me to remove the violinist, but not for someone else. In the case of abortion, this would mean it would be okay for me to perform this procedure on myself, but not for a doctor to do it. This obviously would be a bad result and would lead to a lot of unnecessary pain and suffering, because abortion is not an easy procedure to carry out. In order to have the tools to address what to say about the case where withdrawing benefits also leads to death in a way that would allow us to call it killing, perhaps, Thompson introduces a further case for us to think about. This case involves two brothers who are given a box of chocolates for Christmas. The box of chocolates in the first iteration of this case is given to both brothers. It's a gift for both of them. One of these two brothers takes it, refuses to give the other any chocolates. Thompson points out that in this case, a right has clearly been violated. It's a clear violation of the right to chocolates of one of the two brothers. And as such, we can say that it's a case of injustice. Someone has been treated unjustly here. The brother who has not been given chocolates is being denied something that he has a right to. This is a case where we do have a clear-cut violation of a right. Why? Well, because someone with the power to bestow rights, who owned the chocolate, in this case, was able to create this right and bestow it upon the brothers together. So someone who owns a chocolate can gift it to both brothers. That transfers the right to use of the chocolates to both of the brothers. And so both brothers have a right to these chocolates. And if one of them is denied the chocolates, there's a clear-cut sense in which they are being denied something that is rightfully theirs. Thompson goes on, though, to develop another case where one brother is given the chocolates and the other brother gets nothing. In this case, Thompson points out that if the brother who is given the chocolates refuses to share, there are all kinds of things that we can say about the character of that brother. We can say that brother is greedy, callous, uncaring, unkind, stingy, mean. She gives a list of adjectives. But because the chocolates were only given to one brother, Thompson says that it's clear that no right has been violated. The boy who is deprived of chocolates is not having a right violated, is not being treated unjustly. The boy who is not giving the chocolates might be doing something wrong. We might blame that boy for the behavior of failing to share. We might say that he has a moral character that leaves something to be desired. The claim, though, is that no rights are violated. So we have two cases here where an individual is being treated in a way that we could say isn't quite right. In one of the two cases, though, a right is clearly violated. In the other case, a right is not clearly violated. Now, Thompson wants to suggest that the violinist case is similar to the second case above. So it's a case where maybe it might be better if we were to let the violinist stay attached, but the violinist has no right. Nothing has happened that would confer a right on the violinist. What the box of chocolates case makes clear, and what I think really the thing we're supposed to take away from it is that for there to be a right, there needs to be some kind of action that would serve to confer that right. In the case of the box of chocolates, the right is conferred by the action of gift giving. And who the gift is given to makes a difference when it comes to who has the right to the chocolates. Right? So there's a clear action. Someone is giving this gift, and that gives the right to both or one of the brothers. If the other brother had said to his brother, after having been given the chocolates as the sole beneficiary, I give you half of these, there would then have been a further conferral of rights. Right? So there's got to be some kind of action where the brother who's the sole beneficiary of the chocolates says to the brother that got nothing, I'm going to give you half of them. Once that is done, each of the two brothers has a right to half of the chocolates. Okay, but if that isn't done, the suggestion is that there would be no rights. There would be no violations of rights going on. Whatever else is going on, no rights are being violated. This focus on rights allows Thompson to do something that she refers to as amending the right to life. What Thompson wants to say is that the violinist indeed has the right to life in the non-interference sense, and therefore the violinist has a right not to be killed. She wants to go on, though, and say that the violinist doesn't have the right to use my body to go on living. Now, we've seen already that just saying these two things isn't enough to give us any practical advice, right? Because there are going to be instances where the withdrawal of support and killing overlap. For this reason, Thompson thinks that we need to amend our claim about the right to life possessed by the violinist. This will also mean that we amend, in the analogous case, the right to life possessed by the fetus. The right to life possessed by the violinist is going to turn out to be not just a right not to be killed. So there's a right to life, but that right is no longer being specified in the simple way that says the right to life means a right to non-interference, not being killed. Instead, Thompson wants us to say that the right that the fetus has to not being killed is a right not to be killed unjustly. Whether or not the killing is just or not depends on whether or not there is a right to use my body for sustenance. The right not to be killed unjustly, Thompson thinks, is not triggered unless some rights-granting action has been taken that would make it fair to say that the violinist has the right to use my body. Okay, so this is going to be somewhat like the chocolates case. What we end up saying is somewhat confusing, but I think if you think about it, clear. The main thing that Thompson wants to say is that the right to life that we can concede the fetus has as a person has limitations on it. Namely, the right to life is not a right not to be killed, period. It's a right not to be killed unjustly. Whether or not a killing is just or unjust is in many cases going to depend on further rights or lack thereof. And this is where the chocolate case is supposed to be helping us. The chocolate case is a case where we can see that the right to certain things depends on actions that have been taken that in some way or another confer rights. Now, in order to get clear about what that means, actions taken that might confer rights, we can look at the people seeds case that Thompson introduces. So this is a further thought experiment, and it seems designed to test our intuitions about what kinds of actions in the case of pregnancy might establish a right to use another's body for sustenance and survival. Right? So if we took away from the chocolate case the idea that there needs to be some kind of act that confers rights in the case of pregnancy, if the fetus is going to be entitled to use a body, we're now looking at this people seeds case to try to figure out what our intuitions tell us about what kinds of action or inaction on the part of a parent-to-be can serve to confer a certain right on the fetus to use one's body for sustenance and survival. So in the first case that she gives, there are these people seeds. They're basically like seeds that drift through the air. I imagine kind of like puffballs floating around. These people seeds can drift into houses that have carpets. If those windows on the houses are open, these people seeds can implant themselves in these apartments. And then once they get implanted, they're alive and they require food and shelter. Now, we're supposed to assume, I'm guessing, that the people seeds are people. So they are persons. Therefore, that they probably do have a right to life. Would it be okay if we are the owner of the house to take these people seeds, uproot them, and throw them out, even though that means that we're going to be killing something with a right to life? Thompson interrogates our intuitions on this matter by giving us a number of related cases. Each of these cases is supposed to find a certain analog in the case of pregnancy. So there are some cases where an individual leaves a window open because they want a breeze. The people seed flies in. What are we going to say about that case? That would be a case where a individual voluntarily has sexual intercourse, gets pregnant. Now there is a fetus. Thompson doesn't tell us what to say. We might have different intuitions. The point here is that whether or not the people seed has a right to be there isn't decided by the mere fact that we say it has a right to life. Instead, it seems for Thompson to depend upon whether our action of opening the window, or in the case of pregnancy, having sex, is an action that is strong enough to confer rights on the fetus to use the apartment for survival. There are other cases that Thompson brings up, cases where an individual installs all kinds of screens on the windows, still opens the windows. Sometimes the screens don't work, a people seed still gets in. In such a case, do we have a right to remove it? Or is our opening of the windows, even in the case where we put up screens, an action that confers a certain right on the fetus? The screens, obviously, are meant to represent things like birth control. So if you've taken precautions, is the fact that you've taken precautions enough to mitigate in your favor when it comes to saying, does the people seed or the person have a right to use your apartment or your body? There are further cases where she imagines a burglar. I think in that case, the intuition is supposed to be much clearer, that if a burglar is there and is really trying to violate the personal space, then it's pretty clear that the burglar doesn't have a right to stay. This can be frustrating to think about all these cases because Thompson doesn't give clear answers. Her point, though, I think, is that the details matter. In each of these cases, what an individual has done or failed to do that led to the implanting of a people seed or pregnancy might make a difference as to what we're going to say about the case of removing the people seed or aborting. And so the main point, I think, because it's not totally clear, is that we can say that the people seed as a person has a right to life, but there is a further question which needs to be asked if we want to ask whether it's okay for us to remove that people seed. Because when the right to life overlaps with autonomy rights to our own apartment or our own bodies, when the survival of the fetus involves using my resources that do belong to me, that's my apartment or my body, it isn't enough to say that the fetus has a right to life, because the right to life had by the fetus isn't just a bare right not to be killed, it's a right not to be killed unjustly. It allows for killings that are just. This is the kind of move Thompson wants to suggest. And whether or not killing would be just in the case where that takes the form of removing a people seed and throwing it out of my apartment, or in the case of abortion, has to do with whether an action has been taken that is sufficient to confer rights to use my body or my apartment on the fetus or the people seed. Now, it's not clear what to say about certain actions that are taken. And I think a lot hangs in the balance. Right? So there are cases where Thompson says, well, what if you just open your window because it's very uncomfortable? And, you could, of course, have bare floors, but you have a carpet because it's much more comfortable. And the fact that you could have bare floors, does that mean, because you choose not to, that you're now responsible to take care of the people seed? Personally, I'm not sure what to say, but I think that these thought experiments do add something to the picture. The last thing to say, the last point that Thompson really makes in her paper before she, recaps, concerns this difference between saying that someone morally ought to do something and that someone has a right that they do it. We've already seen this difference. Thompson sort of brings it back and goes further into detail about it. So there's the variant of the violinist case, which I already sort of mentioned, where the violinist in this case only needs to use your body for 1 hour. Here, Thompson concedes that, in fact, morally you ought to let the violinist do this. She denies, though, even in this case, that the violinist has a right to use your body, and that by failing to let the violinist use your body, you are therefore violating the violinist's rights. This is a very important difference, I think, because there are a number of things that we ought to do, morally speaking, that don't involve rights of other people. And if we fail to do those things, we've certainly done something wrong, but no one can claim that they've been wronged or claim redress because of our actions. Now, I'm not sure what exactly this difference amounts to when it comes to morality. When we're talking about legal rights, it's pretty clear that the person whose right has been violated can claim legal redress, whereas if you've just broken a law, there isn't necessarily going to be any individual that now has the ability to have things righted for them, right? So imagine you have hit someone, the person has a right not to be hit, this person now has the ability to sue you, in addition to any penalty the state might exact because you have violated a law. If you just violate a law and you haven't violated anyone's rights, the state, of course, can punish you, but there's no individual who can come after you. Now, in the case of morality, which is what we're talking about, moral rights here, I'm not sure what the difference between the moral ought and moral rights amounts to. But I think there is a difference. Now, Thompson makes a suggestion near the end of her paper as to one thing that might be different about the two cases. With reference to her Henry Fonda case again, she points out that there are cases where what someone ought to do seems to depend in some way or another on how easy it would be for them to do that thing. So, with reference to the Henry Fonda case, she wants to say that if Henry Fonda were a couple feet away from me, and by touching me could make it so that I survive, it seems like in that case Henry Fonda ought to do it, whereas if Henry Fonda is halfway across the world, it seems like it's not true to say that he ought to do it. So she seems to point to this idea that claims about what we ought to do are a little bit more flexible and can take into account different kinds of factors. She says, though, that it would be strange if claims about rights were flexible like that. So, if it's true that I have the right to be touched by Henry Fonda, it seems like the difference about where he is not going to matter. So one thing we can say about this difference, in answer to some of the questions I've been trying to raise, is that rights are firmer. They don't allow for flexibility in the same way. Thompson argues that it would be shocking if rights claims were contingent on the ease or difficulty of meeting them, in the way that ought claims seem to be contingent. Now, we haven't talked about this yet in the class, but we can make some sense of this flexibility of ought versus right claims if we understand ought claims as coming from what we standardly call consequentialist ethical theories. Consequentialist ethical theories, in brief, are theories that tell us that the right action to take is going to be the action that maximizes the good. So we have various options against which we're to judge our action. We have different options we can take. All of those options we can predict will have different outcomes. Some of our actions will really bring more good into the world. Others of our actions will bring less good into the world. The consequentialist tells us that what we are supposed to do, what we ought to do, is going to be the thing that maximizes the good. Rights actually don't fit very comfortably into a consequentialist framework because, in fact, many people who talk about rights have pointed out if rights mean anything, they are supposed to offer a protection against consequentialism. To see what I'm saying, imagine a case where I am hit by a car, I get transported to a hospital, I now have the right to be given medical care, but it is noticed at the hospital that I have a number of organs that might be used to save 20 other people. On a consequentialist analysis, it might look like the thing to do, the thing that will maximize goodness in the world, will be to let me die, take my organs, and distribute them. Individuals who are strongly attached to the idea of rights want to say no, even though the thing that would maximize benefit is distributing his organs, he has a right to medical care. And so you cannot violate it. And therefore, the idea is that rights are meant to be a kind of protection against situations where you might be trampled on in the name of the good of the whole. So a right in this way of looking at things is a right against, in some cases, consequentialist reasoning. I bring up this consequentialism point and tie ought claims to consequentialism because it's clear if this is what's going on with oughts being tied to consequentialist reasoning, meaning what you ought to do is the thing that would maximize overall benefit, and rights are a kind of duty that people have and in fact have to abide by even when doing so would not maximize goodness. If that's what's going on, it does make sense that there's a lot more flexibility with claims about what you ought to do than there is about claims about rights, right? Because imagine the Henry Fonda case. It might be that, in fact, by having to travel halfway around the world, Henry Fonda is actually doing himself such a disservice that any benefits that you would get are going to be outweighed by the disservice done to him and others, perhaps, who are flying him and so on. And so it might turn out that the thing that ought to be done does hinge in a particularly obvious fashion on all kinds of factors that have to do with how easy it is for Henry Fonda to do this. If he's right next to you, there's not going to be any downsides to his just reaching over, right? But if we add that you're really far away, there's presumably going to be all kinds of additional bad things attached to the action that might outweigh the good of him touching you and you surviving. If rights claims, though, aren't part of that consequentialist analysis, that mathematics, then we would expect that they're going to be a lot firmer. This concludes what I wanted to say about this paper. It isn't, in many cases, very clear what we are supposed to think about cases of abortion that don't involve rape or saving the life of the mother. Thompson doesn't give us clear-cut answers here. What Thompson has given us, and what I think we should take away, are certain claims about what kinds of factors are going to be relevant in deciding these further cases. In particular, she wants to claim that there are more factors that are relevant over and above the question of whether or not the fetus is a person and has a right to life. Thompson's main claim is that even if the fetus has a right to life, that doesn't mean we can't kill it, because the right to life that the fetus has is only going to be a right not to be killed unjustly. Whether or not the killing is unjust is going to depend on further questions about whether or not actions that we've taken that resulted in pregnancy or failed to take are sufficient to confer rights to use our bodies on the fetus.